Tak, dámy a pánové, ladies and gentlemen, já vás tady vítám všechny jménem Pražského Centra pro transatlantické vztahy tady při CEVRO Institutu na akci, kterou jsme se rozhodli spolupořádat s našimi partnery v Evropském parlamentu, konkrétně s Aliancí evropských konzervativců a reformistů. Akci, která jsme přemýšleli, čemu se na podzim věnovat, na nějaký trošku více spektakulární akci, a rozhodli jsme se, že ji budeme věnovat tomu, co asi v tomto roce je pro transatlantické vztahy nejdůležitější, a to jsou začínající jednání o smlouvě o v zásadě volném obchodu. Je to konference v angličtině, čili já budu dál mluvit anglicky, aby nemuseli si tady naši hosté dávat na hlavu interpretační zařízení, ale samozřejmě je to i tlumočeno do češtiny, takže kdokoliv se chce zapojit do diskuze, tak samozřejmě pak bude moct učinit jak v angličtině, tak v češtině. So, once again, let me welcome all of you here on this conference on the so-called TTIP, or Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is being co-organized by Prague Center for Transatlantic Relations at the CEVRO Institutu College in cooperation with the Alliance of the European Reformists and Conservatives. Europe and America, or America and Europe, that's what we know as the West. And the West for the past century was something like an anchor or a bedrock of the freedom, stability, and prosperity in the world. And during the decades of the Cold War, this transatlantic bond, transatlantic relationship was mostly materialized in the area of security. But since the end of the Cold War, and in particular with the problems generated by the Western economic crisis, more and more politicians, businesses, economists on the both sides of Atlantic are thinking how to improve the relationship in the area of the economics. It's not surprisingly, because Europe and America together, they are the two largest economic and financial markets in the world. They cover together about 800 million people. Both together, they are almost, or generate almost, half of the global gross economic product. And if it is measured, for example, by the development assistance, humanitarian aids, they both together generate about 80% of the global output. The currencies, euro, dollar, and then the others, constitutes more than 90% of the total holding of the central bank reserves throughout the world. 1/3 of the global trade is a trade where the US and EU are engaged. And the American proportion in the EU trade exchange, as well as the European proportion inside the US trade, constitute about 1/5. If we go to the trade with services, it's even more. It's about 40% of the world trade in services. If we go to the investments, it's even more. It's about half of the FDI in the European market comes from America, and almost the same proportion is for the US market regarding the European foreign direct investments. The logic behind the current talks on the TTIP are stimulated, of course, with the current problems both on the American as well as on the European market. The policymakers, the businesses on the both sides of the Atlantic expect that the liberalization of the trade, more friendly investment climate can contribute to the growth. And in fact, if we are mapping the last 20 years, last 2 decades, it's a history of the repeated attempts to improve the transatlantic relationship in the economic arena. 1990, the first year after the end of the Cold War, is marked with the signature of the Transatlantic Declaration, where George Bush, the old one, on one hand, and people like Helmut Kohl and others were involved on the other side of the Atlantic. Then, in 1995, the NTA, the new Transatlantic Agenda, has been launched in a cooperation of the President Bill Clinton on one hand and the European Commissioner Leon Britton on the other hand. Then in the late 90s, there was a real concentrated effort to stimulate the cooperation in this particular area. 1998, the Transatlantic Economic Partnership, TEP, has been launched, and various other sectoral dialogues like Transatlantic Business Dialogue. Jan Milfait, who is among us today, is a part of that since the beginning, as I remember. And 5 years ago, that was mostly the initiative of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the Transatlantic Economic Council, TEC, has been launched. So since that, this relationship was somehow institutionalized. So right now there are 2 heads of those talks on the top level. Michael Froman from Washington, who is the advisor in the White House, and the Commissioner Karl de Gucht, who has visited Prague for the similar conference like today's just a month ago, which was organized by another think tank here in Prague. Certainly, if we are considering the Czech interest, this country is a trading country. It generates most of its GDP by the trade activities and related activities to the trade. This country has a very open economy. It's one of the most open economies in the world. So, based on all those, let's say, prerogatives, our interest is clear. Our interest is to keep the transatlantic bond strong, because we love to keep America in the European relations engaged, and measured by the economic interest, it's certainly our interest to revitalize the partnership. The timing of the conference is in fact excellent, because this week has marked the second round of the negotiation in Brussels, so we are right on the time here in the center of Prague. Of course, we are also paying a certain price for this, because when we were starting to plan the conference with the date, we did not expect the second round to be held in Brussels this week. But it happened because there was a deadlock with the US budget, you remember, a few weeks ago, and that led to the postponement of the second round of the negotiation. And therefore, Ignacio Barcero, who is the chief EU negotiator, has to excuse himself but sent a very valuable substitution. So nothing is free of charge, of course, neither in business nor in the politics. So, just to sum up, you will hear the views from the US. That's the first panel where we will start. Then we will follow up with exposing the European position and the European interest, and then, with the evening coming close, we will have also a time for discussing the Czech interest. And last but not least, Jan Zahradil is coming from Brussels and should be here at 6:30, and should amuse us about a position of the European Parliament, which is pretty important in the current affairs. So here we are, once again, welcome here at CEVRO Institute, and I will start with introducing, because we will go directly to the first panel, to introduce our first speaker here, which is Simon Lester. Simon Lester is the trade policy analyst with Cato Institute. I expect that most of the people here at CEVRO knows what Cato is. Those who don't, it's a classic organization which promotes individual freedom, limited government, and free market. Therefore, it's logically an institution which spends a lot of time in promoting the free trade agenda on the other side of the Atlantic. Simon has a lot of experiences also from working with the other institutions, the private law firms. He was engaged with WTO, the World Trade Organization, too, in the past. He studied law at the Harvard Law School, and I am very glad that he had found a time in his busy schedule to come to Prague. So, Simon, floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me over here, giving me a chance to see this beautiful and historic city of Prague. I spent a lot of years living in South Florida in the United States, and you may not be familiar with it, but it's quite a contrast. In my neighborhood in South Florida, I lived on the oldest house on the block, and it was built in 1980. So this is a real treat to see a city as historic as this one is. Today's agenda says that I'll be providing the American perspective on the TTIP. I feel compelled to note here that there are probably a range of American perspectives. Mine will be that of a Cato Institute, liberty-loving, free trader American, which may be different from the establishment American perspective at times. I can try to explain the official U.S. position, but I may not always agree with it. So perhaps we should say that I'm providing an American perspective rather than the American perspective. America is a big and diverse place. It has lots of different perspectives. I want to start with a little bit just about U.S. trade politics and procedure. I think this may offer some helpful context in evaluating the TTIP's prospects. And first, let me talk a little bit about the evolution of President Obama's approach to trade policy. During his first presidential campaign in 2008, candidate Obama seemed like a bit of a trade skeptic. There was talk, for example, of renegotiating the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was probably an attempt to appeal to protectionists without actually proposing protectionism. If you looked at the details of what he was proposing, it was mostly just minor tweaks to the NAFTA rather than a complete repeal. But then after his election, trade still did not seem to be much of a priority. The talk about NAFTA disappeared. He didn't take on new trade negotiating initiatives, and he took a lot of time with 3 smaller free trade agreements that had been negotiated by the Bush administration, and Obama eventually got these pushed through Congress, but it was very slow. So in the early years of the Obama trade administration, trade was mostly ignored. Recently, though, things have changed, and President Obama seems much more enthusiastic about trade agreements. And maybe this is because the financial crisis, the economic crisis, has dissipated a bit. Maybe it's because it's something he has a bit more control over than domestic matters. He can negotiate on his own without having to deal with Congress, although, as I'll talk about in a second, he does eventually have to get Congress approval on all of this. So as one example of this newfound enthusiasm for trade, the U.S. has gotten behind something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP talks. And this is a trade negotiation involving 12 countries that are all around the Pacific, although not all the countries around the Pacific, just a certain group of them. And this is part of the more general pivot to Asia in U.S. foreign policy. So this started first, but now we also have the TTIP, which was mentioned first to the American people early this year during the President's State of the Union speech, and now, as we know, negotiations are underway. Now, by all accounts, this was something that the EU was pushing, and the U.S. was a little bit resistant, but now the U.S. is on board. Whatever the reason for any initial skepticism, the U.S. is now enthusiastic and pushing ahead with this. So Obama's trade policy has come around from his 2008 campaign rhetoric, and he's now firmly behind these trade agreements. So that's the politics of it. I want to say a bit now about the procedures for negotiating trade agreements in the U.S. When you talk about U.S. trade policy, you need to understand the actors involved. You have the President, and then you have Congress. The President can go negotiate, but ultimately Congress has to approve these deals. And it works like this, in a nutshell. Congress, and by that I mean the leadership of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So Congress and the President agree in very general terms on what will be in these trade agreements. The President then goes off and negotiates with other countries, and then Congress has to approve the result with a vote on the final deal in a very quick process that does not allow for amendments. As you may be aware, sometimes congressional voting can become a very difficult thing. They've tried to make it easy by just saying you have to vote yes or no, and a majority approval will mean the deal passes. This used to be called fast track. It is now called trade promotion authority. Without this, everyone assumes trade deals could not be completed. They would get bogged down in Congress with amendments. So everyone assumes we need this. We don't have it right now. Congress and the President last agreed on these terms back in 2007 in the context of other trade agreements. But now it's a different Congress and a different President, and they have not yet reached agreement. So right now we are negotiating the TPP and the TTIP without any presidential congressional agreement. And the idea seems to be we can negotiate with other countries first. The President can negotiate with other countries first, and then at the end go to Congress and get approval. Will that work? We'll see. For the TPP, I think it could be difficult because Japan is in these talks, Vietnam is in these talks, and there are people in Congress who have big concerns about things like labor rights in Vietnam or alleged exchange rate manipulation in Japan. So for there, I can see the argument for getting everyone on the same page first. For the TTIP, I'm a little less worried. I think Congress won't be as nervous about a trade agreement with the EU, so I think it's probable, although it's hard to be certain about anything related to U.S. politics, the lack of trade promotion authority will not be as big a deal for the TTIP. Okay, so that was some politics and procedures. Let me turn now to the substance, the benefits of having a TTIP and some hurdles. Now, clearly there's great potential here, not just for the specific economic benefits of the TTIP, freeing up trade and investment, but also for creating momentum for trade negotiations more generally. It has been a while since there has been a big trade negotiating success, and it's getting a little depressing for us free traders. For those of you who follow these things, the WTO talks have been stalled for many years now. With the US-EU talks, maybe we can finally get a big win for free trade, and we can then build on that in the WTO and other places. But I do have concerns about some aspects of the talks. One is, I think we need to be careful when we throw around estimates of GDP growth and jobs numbers related to trade agreements. We really can't be that precise about the benefits of free trade. So if you read about these things, you'll see studies that economists come out with saying, the long-term GDP will climb 13.4%. So the first bullet point there, I think, really, so 1.1 million more American jobs, 400,000 more British jobs. Lots of very specific numbers from economists. Now, don't get me wrong, I agree that there are benefits, but I think it's hard to quantify them so precisely, and I worry that too much cheerleading and failed predictions about these numbers can come back to haunt us. So there's talk now about how the U.S. trade deficit with Korea grew after we signed a free trade agreement with Korea. Now, to me, that doesn't matter because I don't think trade deficits are a bad thing or a good thing. It really is irrelevant for measuring economic well-being. But when governments market these free trade agreements as something that will increase exports or jobs or income gains, there's always a risk that the predictions won't come true, and then the critics will pounce, as we've seen. Another concern I have is that trade talks take a long time these days, and sometimes they just stall. And I worry that the TTIP will be the same. So trade officials now are confidently predicting that these talks will be done on 1 tank of gas, they say, and they've said by 2014. And I worry that that's unrealistic. Perhaps if we were driving a Prius, we might be able to do it, but I fear that we are driving a Hummer, and we just don't have enough gas to do it. I understand the desire to get people motivated by setting clear end dates, but I worry that this is not the best approach. Now, third, and most importantly, I think that free trade supporters need to look carefully at agreements that are billed as free trade. Trade talks today are much more complex than they used to be, and we need to look at the details. So here, we already know that subsidies are going to be excluded from this agreement, and that's been a source of many trade disputes between the U.S. and the EU. Trade remedies, which are anti-dumping and countervailing duties, are also going to be excluded. There's questions about how much agricultural liberalization will be in there. So the first question for a free trader like me is, well, what's the free trade that's going to be in this trade agreement? Well, don't worry, there's definitely some real trade liberalization in there, and let me just go through some of it. Although first let me qualify it by having one more criticism, which is some would say this is actually more preferential trade than free trade. This is liberalizing trade just between 2 economies rather than the whole world, and so what we end up doing is charging lower tariffs on products from the EU or US than, say, products from Brazil. But let's put that aside for now. So here, let me focus on the positive now. Here are some examples of the trade liberalization that will be in this agreement. Elimination of tariff duties. This is the traditional core of trade agreements. Now, it's true that duties on trade between the US and EU are already low, but there's a lot of trade, so the impact of removing these duties will be significant. If we can lower the tariff duties on US-EU trade to a similar degree as what Canada and the EU have done in their almost completed agreement, which will remove about 99% of all tariffs, that will be great for consumers. Another item is services liberalization. I think everyone's still trying to get a handle conceptually on what it means to trade services across borders, but over time, services are becoming a more and more significant part of the economy. information technology services, legal services, higher education services. They all offer great opportunities for liberalization. And I'd love to see more international competition in all of these areas. As a last example, opening up more of our government procurement to foreign firms is good. Again, there are benefits from increased competition. And from my perspective, this is all great if all of this can get done. But although there is real trade liberalization in there, I do worry that core free trade issues are getting crowded out by other subjects. These days, trade agreements seem to be just as much about global rules on intellectual property as they are about fighting protectionism. The EU is always pushing for stronger protections on geographical indications. The US is pushing for longer copyright protection terms. It has been argued, and I'm sympathetic to this argument, that when we push the level of intellectual property protection as high as we do, it becomes more of a trade restriction than promoting trade. Now, that's my libertarianism coming out. The establishment US and EU government positions are much different. They're very strongly supportive of more intellectual property protection. Another concern is that the carve-outs seem to be multiplying. Some sectors are already being taken off the table. So the US wants to take financial services and maritime services out. The EU wants to take audio-visual goods and services, cultural sectors out. And we need to make sure that the exceptions don't swallow up the agreement. Now, beyond these sectoral issues, there are some more systemic disagreements, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of my presentation. I want to talk now about some serious potential hurdles that the negotiators might face. I have three. There are three that I have in mind. I'm just going to focus on one. During the question and answer, we might get to the other two. The first issue, the issue I want to talk about is regulatory trade barriers. And this is the issue that everyone has been talking about as the main benefit of these negotiations. Just on my flight over here, just reading the Wall Street Journal, that's the lead article about the TTIP, is that this is all about barriers. Tariffs are good, they're important, but the real economic gains are from dealing with these regulatory trade barriers. You hear this expression all the time if you follow these things, regulatory trade barriers. But what do people mean by this? I think this needs to be fleshed out. What is it that these talks are going to do with the issue of domestic regulation and how it becomes a trade barrier? Well, I'm not sure what everyone means. My sense is that people are using it in different ways. But here's how I think about it. Within this general category of regulatory trade barriers, there are several subcategories. And I'm going to first set them out briefly, and then I'll come back and talk about them in more detail. The first type is regulatory divergence. This is where regulations in the same policy area, like automobile safety, differ across countries. So different people regulating the same thing might come out a little bit differently. And sometimes it's just an arbitrary difference. Sometimes it's based on an actual policy preference. Second issue is the regulatory process and reform of that process, how governments regulate, the institutions, the procedures, the factors they take into account. So in the US, we talk a lot about cost-benefit analysis of each regulation. In the EU, they talk about the precautionary principle. There's also the issue of whether you have public comments on new regulations. Third category is regulatory protectionism. This is when you have regulations used for protectionist purposes. Let me start with this one because this is the easiest. I think we can get this out of the way. Let's say you have an environmental protection statute, but someone slips in a provision to favor domestic firms. So imagine a government says, we want to use more renewable energy, like solar panels. But they also say that a certain percentage of it has to come from domestic sources. Well, for the most part, this is already prohibited by WTO rules. And over the years, there have been many WTO cases involving regulatory protectionism. So as I see it, the WTO deals with this issue pretty well. It's already taken care of. And I don't think it'll be part of the US-EU trade talks as far as I can see. So I'm going to cross that out and now focus on the two issues that I think are the key here. So starting with regulatory divergence. So there was a working group report that set out the framework for these talks. And in that report, there were references to promoting regulatory compatibility and reducing costs stemming from regulatory differences. And this is touted as an area of great potential economic benefit, and I agree that it is. If one country uses one standard, another country uses another standard, companies are left to sort it out, and it's a high cost to everyone. And can't we do something about this? I think the answer is yes, but the hard questions are what to do and where to do it. Does it make sense to do it in a trade agreement? Or should this be done through some kind of more simple and direct regulatory cooperation, where the regulators for specific industries meet and discuss ways to make regulations more compatible? I'll come back to this later. So, next issue now, domestic regulatory process, how governments regulate. The same working group report referred to things like regulatory impact assessments and good regulatory practices. In a sense, this is about how do we regulate effectively and efficiently. The TTIP discussion on this has started already, and so far it seems a bit tense. The U.S. Trade Representative, Mike Froman, went to Brussels, and he told his European colleagues that they need to reform their regulatory process to look more like the U.S. model. Specifically, he wants to have public comments on draft regulations, which is something that we do in the U.S., but they don't have it in the EU, at least not the way the U.S. government wants them to. In reaction to this, the EU Trade Commissioner responded with a speech of his own on regulatory trade issues, arguing that instead of one country forcing another to change its model, the focus should be on a regulatory cooperation council to address arbitrary differences between regulations. As a further bone of contention, as I mentioned earlier, the EU likes the precautionary principle as part of its regulatory process. And loosely speaking, that means you have to prove products are safe before they can be sold in your market, rather than approving them in the absence of proof of harm. The U.S., by contrast, favors what it would call a more flexible cost-benefit analysis. And in his speech in Brussels, U.S. Trade Representative Froman explained that the differences between these two regimes have been exaggerated. That may be true, but they do exist. So, given these clear differences between the U.S. and EU negotiating position, will the two sides be able to agree on anything? It looks challenging to me. So with all that as background on what the U.S.-EU trade rules might cover in the area of regulation, here's the question I want to raise. So what should the talks do with this issue? I will give you my view on it for whatever it's worth. To me, regulatory process reform may be too much to handle. I'm just not sure it's feasible to do this in trade or other international agreements beyond certain things that the WTO already does. I haven't heard much about the specific benefits here of reforming the regulatory process, and the costs seem very high to me in terms of interfering with domestic policy making. I think that a discussion forum for these issues can be useful, where everyone exchanges views on how they regulate, but trying to push a particular model of regulation on others is problematic. And this is an issue where I take a different view than the U.S. establishment view. On the other hand, I think that some of the regulatory divergence issues can be handled somewhere. I think the economic benefits are more clear, and I think it shouldn't be as controversial in terms of interference with domestic policymaking. Now, as to where to address these, I think that what you need is a regulatory cooperation mechanism, and so I sort of take the EU side of this debate to some extent. It doesn't have to be formally part of a trade agreement, in my view, although it could be. So as an example, the U.S. has something right now with Canada called the U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council, where there's a process for resolving issues like this with private sector input. The private sector can identify problems, and governments can sit down and try to work out the ones that are solvable. This U.S.-Canada mechanism is fairly new, so we don't have a great sense yet of what it can accomplish, and I think the degree of success that Canada and the U.S. have there in the coming months or years might help show us the best way forward on these issues. So just to illustrate all of this, because I think concrete examples can be helpful, let's take the example of automobile safety. I'm no expert on this, but if I had to guess, I would say that both the EU and the U.S. have extensive safety regulations for automobiles. Can't we just assume that cars that meet the requirements of one market are safe to be sold in the other market? I think probably yes. So why not just agree that they can be? I'm not sure any big trade agreement negotiation is needed here, just a simple sign-off on what seems pretty obvious. Now, auto safety may be a fairly easy issue, but others are more difficult. So, for example, I think we're unlikely to solve problems such as different opinions on hormone-treated beef, where Americans and Europeans fundamentally disagree. The working group report I mentioned talks about special provisions on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, perhaps as a way to deal with issues like this one. But in my view, legal obligations can only do so much here. Where people fundamentally disagree, I'm not sure that issue can be solved. So, to sum up, can something be done here? Yes, I think so. But first, the US and EU have to agree on what the problem is they're addressing. So I have two other issues that I'll just mention briefly that could be big potential hurdles. One is the issue of data flows and data privacy. I'm sure you've all heard about the recent spying scandals, and that has intensified a debate that's been going on for a number of years about the free flow of data between countries, where you have some big U.S. internet companies who are pushing for more freely flowing data, and European regulators worrying about data privacy. I think these issues have intensified because of the recent revelations about NSA spying. Another issue is the protection of foreign investment. There's a special set of rules that exist to protect foreign investors and allow them to bring lawsuits in international tribunals. These have caused controversies in the U.S., a little bit less in the EU. The U.S. and EU have kind of a different take on what these provisions should say, and there are groups in both who are strongly opposed to these issues, to including these rules in trade agreements. So this is another big hurdle that we can talk about if people want to talk about it later. So let me just close with the following now. I think it's a mistake to get caught up in dreams of a transatlantic single market, where anything we can sell in the U.S. can also be sold in the EU and vice versa, and all data flows freely. I think maybe someday in the distant future we can have something like that, but for now, I think we need to be realistic. I think we need to think about what can be achieved and what's the best way to achieve it. Trade liberalization is clearly good from my perspective, but I think it's important to understand what the different components of trade talks are. When we lump everything related to trade into one big negotiation, we may end up with none of it, and we will be worse off as a result. I think it's still too early to say how the TTIP will fare. I think these talks usually take longer than predicted, so the 2014 end date that many have pointed to is probably too optimistic. But I think we can have a deal eventually if we're realistic in our approach. It may end up being more limited than some are picturing, but I think it can be done. Thank you.
Well, Simon, thank you very, very much. I think your an-American view was shared by many of us, at least by me, almost fully. In particular, this attempt, to divide what is a really promotion of the free trade and liberalization agenda, and what, on the other hand, could be a different approach, protectionist approach under the flag of the free trade. I think it was very valuable to hear something about the logic of the current U.S. debate. So the other gentleman to show up today is Weston Stacey. Weston Stacey is a long-time executive director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here. If I say long time, I was trying today morning to find on the internet when you came to Prague, but was not able to find it. It's a secret information, but 1991. So you are among the first Americans to come after the Velvet Revolution, because in my mind you are something like a walking history of the U.S.-Czech business relationship. You have promised us to give us a bunch of figures and facts, or at least what I have heard from Luděk Jiráček when he was talking. So we certainly are looking forward for your presentation. And I think it's important because given the fact that many of those issues in the last attempts somehow diminished or did not succeed, at least, because of the various political fights, fears, etc. And we are living in a world with no less political fights, including the US. And the usual question is that, we do have some goals, but then what are the results? And here everybody argues, at least what I have heard, that at the end this is the interest of the business in particular, and it will take care that the final agreement will not be sacrificed to the political fight, that the business will take care of that. So if you can give us a bit of amusement on that particular issue, we would appreciate it too. So, Weston, Stacey.
So, good afternoon. I think Mr. Vondra, I'm used to calling him Sasha, and I'm trying to be more formal today. Mr. Vondra had a very polite way of saying what my wife has said for years, which is that I'm walking history. My presentation is entitled Organic Stimulus, and why I said that is because the U.S. Chamber has been pushing for the EU-U.S. trade treaty for several years, pushing in Washington for the Obama administration to engage and initiate it, because there was a discussion during the U.S. crisis about how we could improve the economic performance of both Europe and the United States in a way that would last longer than dumping money into the market for a few years, making artificial stimulus. And one of the ways that the U.S. Chamber came up with was a trade treaty with the EU. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's why the U.S. Chamber is so enthusiastic about the trade treaty. Why am I here today? Well, because Peter Chase can't be. Peter Chase is the head, spearheading the TTIP negotiations for the U.S. Chamber. He's based in Brussels. He's the vice president of the U.S. Chamber. My role is to deal with issues between the U.S. business and the Czech Republic. So hopefully my role in this negotiation on the trade treaty will remain very minor. Peter was here, I think, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, and he had a chance to meet with most of the relevant people on the TTIP, and he was very impressed with the engagement and the level of quality of the people that are working on this issue in the Czech Republic. He had a chance to meet with Mr. Vondra as well. I think that he's looking at everything in a very favorable light, and as I said, hopefully he'll be back over here to meet with the parties in the near future. So let me get on with the presentation. So one thing that we should all note, maybe everybody should be on the same page, the trade partnership between the EU and the US is the largest in history, or at least the largest since, we've been recording this stuff. You can talk proportionally about other relationships, but the amount of trade, the amount of investment between the country is substantially larger than anything that currently or in the past. If you look at the U.S. Investment into China, it's very much lower than the investment into the EU. Even today, even with all of the headlines about China, the EU remains the U.S.'s biggest trade partner and will be for a long time to come. It's also the most technologically developed trade relationship, which means if you have technology, technology is where you get the premiums, premiums is where you get the prosperity. So the relationship between these two countries is where both countries are generating their true prosperity. The relationship is also, and I think Simon talked about it a little bit. It's the creator of global standards. Often it's the creator of two different global standards, but sometimes it's the creator of one global standard. And hopefully, if you have a treaty, this treaty will be able to address it so that we can create one global standard, and that will create even greater premiums for business. And yes, business will profit, but business creates jobs, and jobs pay people money. So I think that it will benefit more than just businesses per se. The U.S. Chamber believes that TTIP is going to accelerate the integration of these two economies and generate new competitive advantages for both economies. And where we are today is that, sorry, I have one presentation on my iPad and another down here. So I'm trying to keep you on the same page as I am. Be a good start for trade negotiations, no? Today the tariffs are comparatively low. They average about 5 to 7.5. It's not 75%. Sorry, I was working too fast. So 5 to 7.5%. The entities represent about 44% of world GDP, 62% of inward FDI, and 27% of world exports. And there's an enormous amount of intra-industry trade. That means trade between the same industry, between the two countries. Simon says that you shouldn't believe numbers. He's a lawyer, right? So the U.S. Chamber always tries to measure everything. We believe Michael Bloomberg, which says if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we've got numbers. How believable they are, well, you judge for yourself. But we've done a study with some Swedish economists, and they believe that the static effect of the TTIP, which means just removing the tariffs, would result in EU GDP growth of 1.6 billion US dollars. I'm not sure why they did everything in US dollars, but I guess that was because the US Chamber asked instead of euros. The EU gains in efficiency, investment, and savings of about US 3 billion, and that EU total sectorial output would rise by about 140 billion US dollars. And there would be big gains in petrochemicals, mineral products, motor vehicles, construction, and processed food. So that's the static effect. And the dynamic model, which means that you eliminate the tariffs, plus you decrease the trade facilitation costs, increase labor productivity due to intra-industry trade. The EU GDP increase would be about 46 to 69 billion US dollars. It's not so precise, Simon. We're giving us a range there. And there's not 0.5. So the EU gains in efficiency, investment, and savings would be about 58 to 86 billion, and exports to the U.S. would increase by about 18% to USD 69 billion. So a fairly significant increase if the trade treaty is passed. So what stands in the way? Well, the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress is synonymous with the devil these days, so it's the first thing that can be blamed for any problem. And I think it could be a significant problem. For one, as Simon said, the U.S. Congress has to approve any trade negotiations, and it typically depends on the relationship with the president. And the relationship between the U.S. Congress and the president these days is not optimal. So I would say that from the U.S. side, that's the one thing to really watch. The other thing that's of concern is, of course, the EU has been given the authority to negotiate on behalf of the EU member states, but there are a lot of member states that have different economic interests, and there might be some individual interests that block the process. The other issue could be business, and Simon mentioned a few of the areas. Some businesses are going to be not as happy as other about a free trade agreement, and some will want their countries to issue protectionist measures. And I think it's important for organizations like the U.S. Chamber and their equivalent in Europe to represent the broad spectrum of business and not just individual industries, to make sure that the trade treaty is as comprehensive as possible. The other big enemy, as it is with any sort of political negotiation, is time, because time means that you have elections. And with every election in the U.S., they're talking about European socialism and how the Europeans have imposed European health care on the United States, and it can create friction. And on the other side, sometimes the U.S. is viewed as a political bogeyman by European politicians, and it can create frictions between the countries which could damage the negotiations. And that's all I've got. That's hopefully not the end. Yeah.
Okay, the figures were quite relaxed, so I think even a lawyer cannot argue that those figures are serving the ideology. Look, we should open the debate. Thank you for being short, so it gives, instead of 15 minutes, we do have 30 minutes now, if I am right, for the debate. That's certainly appreciated. So you should prepare your questions, comments. Meantime, I want to try to open that and to offer you a time for rethink your question. Simon, you started your intervention with describing this political theater in the United States. You rightly mentioned what maybe the people has already forgotten, that President Obama, in fact, during his first election campaign, was campaigning against the free trade. Now, after we have learned, or he has learned, the lesson of the financial and economic crisis, he and his administration is pretty supportive. And just in the light, for example, of the current debate on the healthcare, which we have observed, my question is this. I'm trying to imagine that, 2 years negotiations, then an agreement, and it will go to the parliamentary consent or ratification. It would be sometimes close to the Obama's second and the last term. And here is the dilemma, whether to offer the president who was campaigning against to become the part of the history and to build his legacy as a great president who has achieved the agreement on the free trade between the US and the EU, something what all his predecessors who were campaigning on the pro-free trade, both the Republicans and Democrats, because Clinton generally was a pro-free trader. So whether the Republicans would allow him to become the president, in fact, a liberator, or how the economic liberator, or whether it could fall into the trap of this political debate. I look into some statistics. I have to put this out of my bag. Finding a magazine that's from 2009, but here is a table, with enlisting all the major free trade legislation approved by the U.S. Congress, including fast track for the Uruguay round of the WTO, NAFTA agreement, U.S.-Chile, U.S.-Singapore free trade agreement, Australia, Morocco, Peru, Bahrain, etc. And in the table, there is a statistic about the vote in the House, and in all major votes on those major treaties, the ratio among the Republicans was 90% of Republicans for the Trade Agreement Act of 1979. I know this is one of the oldest. Uruguay, around 85% of Republicans agree. NAFTA, 75% of Republicans. Chile, Singapore, 86%, etc. So we are in those numbers. While while the Democrats, 40% for NAFTA, 56% for fast track on the Uruguay round, 37% for U.S.-Chile free trade agreement, 37% for U.S.-Singapore. Then it was a little bit higher in the case of Australia. It was 57% and 59% for Morocco. So this is the history of the, let's say, last 20 years. So what do you expect to happen in the U.S. Congress in this dilemma?
Let me start with a caveat in that anything I say about politics is more instinct than anything. I don't know. I don't know how to predict how U.S. politics will turn out on any issues, much less trade issues. But, that won't stop me from making predictions. Let me start by going back to the Obama 2008 campaign. I know the rhetoric came across as, protectionist, you should support me. But I really felt like when you looked at the specifics of what he was saying, it was just a very narrow criticism of certain aspects of NAFTA. So I don't think he was ever, in his heart, against free trade, but he was using it for political purposes. He was using protectionism for political purposes. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I mean, politicians have to make choices like this. But I don't think he was ever a true believer in protectionism, for whatever that's worth. Maybe that makes the evolution a little less strong. It really wasn't that much of an evolution. It was just a question of which priorities he was going to emphasize, how he was going to present things. He's a politician, that they do this sort of thing. So, now, as to how the Republicans in Congress will deal with this issue, my instinct is they will not, try to prevent Obama from having this success. And I guess here's why I think that. A couple of reasons. One is they actually believe in these trade agreements, and so do their constituents, who are often, business groups. And so they're not going to reject something that they like and that they want just to make Obama look bad. It would be a little too blatant and obvious, and it would go against their own beliefs and constituents' interests. Whether they'd go against their own beliefs, I don't know, possibly. Going against their constituents' interest, that's less likely. So I think that will trump the idea of let's score a political victory and make sure Obama doesn't achieve anything. I think that they might deep in their hearts want that, but they would rather have something they actually like. I mean, they're still out there. Many Republicans are still out there, pushing for these trade agreements. They are, as you presented the statistics, they're the ones who support these. They really do believe in it to a great extent. Another reason that they might support, still allowed Obama this success is because Republicans see this as a great way to divide Democrats, force the Democrats to, have these intra-party battles over the right course. The Democrats do this to the Republicans all the time. I mean, everyone does it to each other. Let's highlight your differences and make you fight with each other. So there's another good reason for them to do it. It works for them politically. So I guess one caveat to all this is it depends what the agreements say, and there are some things that Republicans don't want in trade agreements. So I'm trying to imagine, is there something that would be in there that they really didn't like? They were resistant to the idea of having binding and enforceable labor environmental provisions in trade agreements, but they seem to have accepted that. So I'm not sure what could be put in either the TTIP or the TPP that would make them say, oh, no, that's too much, we reject it. But I don't know, maybe there's something I'm not aware of. One other wild card to point out is that there are members of the Tea Party who are actually free traders who don't like trade agreements for a couple different reasons. One is they don't go far enough, and they're not actually complete free trade. They would prefer just to unilaterally remove all tariffs and all barriers to trade. And this really doesn't go far enough. They call trade agreements managed trade. And another is the impact these trade agreements have on sovereignty, and there are some members of the Tea Party who are very concerned about it. So just for example, one of the most famous Tea Party people is Senator Rand Paul. And I've been for a year or two been trying to figure out, what does Rand Paul think of trade agreements? And I can't figure out. He hasn't said. I mean, I think he's carefully avoided the issue. I read an article where somebody who was supposed to be an advisor of Rand Paul was very critical of these trade agreements for the same reasons I just suggested. But I haven't seen Rand Paul say that. So there is an open question for me as to, are there some Republican Tea Party types who are strong believers in free trade but don't like trade agreements and might oppose an Obama generated trade agreement on that basis? It's possible, but I don't know the numbers. I don't know how many of them there would be. But on balance, especially with the TTIP, which is going to be, I think, a lot less controversial than TPP, if the U.S. and EU can negotiate a deal, I would think Congress will sign off on it, will support it. I mean, I don't want to say 100% support, but it will get majority support, and it will pass. So, but I can never be absolutely certain about anything in politics.
Weston, will the U.S. business allow to fail that?
I don't think so. I mean, in U.S. politics, it's like any politics. If you follow the money flow, what's supporting the Republican Party, there are very large organizations that would be very upset, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is probably the biggest donor to U.S. congressional races. They would not be happy if the trade agreement would be voted down by the Republicans. Is that right? Sorry. So my guess is that the optimum Republican strategy is to have the trade treaty be the first thing signed by the new Republican president that's replacing Barack Obama. So I don't think that the Republicans will oppose it. I don't think that the Tea Party will propose it, because the main source of money behind the Tea Party also has extensive investments in Europe. And would not be happy if the free trade agreement was canceled.
Okay, so now the floor is open. We have more than 15 minutes for the Q&A, so please raise your hand, and I hope you prepare your questions or comments or remarks. No one? Are so satisfied with what you have heard? There I see a question. The microphone is coming. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, dobrý den. My name is Daniel. On? Yeah. My name is Daniel Anish. I'm with Czech daily paper, Hospodářské noviny. This is just a question to the Trade Promotion Authority. Why President Obama didn't ask for it, or did he ask and the Congress didn't vote? What's the reason? Because you mentioned that could be trouble in the end.
I think one thing is they're still trying to work out the terms of what should be in it. It's more than just a formal authorization to negotiate. Often what it does is it's an agreement between Congress and the President as to what he should be negotiating in trade agreements. And they have to decide what should be in that. And I don't know that there's agreement out there. It'll take work to get the leaders of Congress and the administration to sit down, and that work just hasn't been done yet. I think there's a feeling that it's just not that urgent. We can get it when we need it, and it's going to be very difficult to get it because we have to sit down and agree, so let's just not push this right now. There are other things we have to deal with. That's my sense. It just there doesn't seem to be that sense of urgency. I mean, if it needed to be done, they would sit down and do it first, but I don't think they need to do it. They'll negotiate the agreement, and sometime in the next year, before the agreement is ready to be presented to Congress, they'll get trade promotion authority. So my instinct is they think they don't need it now. They can get it when they need it. So it's not a crisis. So let's not deal with it. We'll deal with any crisis. We'll deal with now. This is not a crisis. We'll deal with it later.
Okay, I need a microphone to the first row here.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Zdeněk Čech. I'm from European Commission. I got questions to Simon, whether you could be more specific or whether you could provide us with some sense on where do you see between Europe and the US the biggest regulatory divergence, or where do you see where the biggest deadlock might arise, and what could be the solution to that, I mean, going forward?
Are you asking what are specific divergences? I don't have an answer to that. I've been working on a couple different papers on this, and I've been trying to come up with clear examples that make this concrete. And I don't think I found one that was just so obvious that or so big that it took precedence. But I mean, automobile safety and regulation is, I think, a very good one that everyone understands. I mean, I don't think any of us feel like if we're driving a U.S. car versus a European car, there's any major difference, any reason to be concerned. So I like that one. And another one that I found, and I think this is smaller, but still, it was something that I could picture and identify with, is car headlights. Apparently, some European automakers have developed these fancy headlights that have sort of a dimming that kind of adjusts based on the light, whereas in the U.S. you're only allowed to do kind of on and off for high beams. And so that's a very minor one, but I think it was just a good example of you have regulations that are different for no reason that anyone can see. Every sector, every product, every service we have a highly regulated economy, both of us. And every sector has regulations. Financial services, legal services, manufactured products, chemicals. So I don't think it's just one. I think it's all of them. And that's why, to me, the key is to just set up some institution. We can't deal with them all at once. But if we set up some institution where when the differences become apparent and people want resolution, they have a place to go. So to me, that's the important thing. Set up an institution where you can deal with these issues. Because, we can't sit down in a trade agreement and deal with every one, because I would guess there are thousands. So I don't have one that just is the big one. There's just lots and lots of little ones, and we just need a place to deal with them.
I don't see any hand. Veronica?
Thank you very much. Veronika Kuchinová-Smigolová from the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have sometimes the feeling here in Europe that US is just one country, if EU is 28, so it's much easier for the US to negotiate than for the EU. My question is how much, I know the trade is a federal competence in the US, but are there any areas where the US states have to be consulted or participate? For example, public procurement, as I know, and do you see any difficulties in this context in the negotiations? Thank you.
I mean, I think you've answered the question as well as I could. Yes, I mean, public procurement is the big one where, I mean, if you want U.S. state government procurement to be open to foreign competition, well, the state governments have to agree to that. And so the federal government has to work with the states and communicate with them, and these states have to agree to open up. I mean, there is general interest among a number of state legislatures, particularly in Democratic regions. There are concerns expressed about investor-state dispute settlement and, the idea that trade agreements might undermine domestic regulation. So they are interested in general in that sense, and then they express their concerns to the federal government, but they don't really get a vote on those issues, so perhaps they can just be ignored. But no, aside from procurement, where there has to be a specific sign-off, the states don't play that big a role. And in the U.S., the battle is more, within the federal government. And so you have the president and Congress. And now you also have all these different agencies that are involved. So you have the U.S. Trade Representative, but if you're dealing with regulation, well, all of the particular regulators have to be consulted on this. Well, what do they think about it? And they often think, well, we don't want to do more work. We already have to do our own work in regulating. We now have to go consult with our colleagues, and I mean, a free trip to Europe might be nice, but that's more work, and no, we don't want to do it. So I think it's mostly the battle of all the different agencies and bodies within the U.S. government and getting them to agree, and then, based on that agreement, go to Europe and negotiate with them, but with the realization that you're constrained by what you've agreed with, within the U.S. government. So.
Procurement's going to be the big one, but the other thing, the Congress is representatives of states, and so you're going to see commercial interests probably intervene through the Congress during the ratification process.
Yeah, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jiří Klein. I'm Secretary General to the Senate of the Parliament of Czech Republic. By the way, I'm economist by original profession, and I spent the majority of my career in multinational businesses. My question goes to Weston. Last week, Czech National Bank surprised both importers and exporters by the massive market intervention against exchange rate of the Czech crown against euro and other foreign currencies. So what's your opinion? Does it help or stimulate Czech-US trade and FDI, or what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
All right, well, that's not TTIP related.
It's TTIP related. Sorry for interrupting you. We were discussing this. If this contributes to the increase of the prices of the imported goods, then there is another incentive why the free trade is important, because then it will contribute to get this imported goods against cheaper.
The short answer is that we don't really know. We don't understand the move so well. Over the long term, I don't think it's going to have a great impact on prices. Maybe in the short term it will. But we've been asking companies, so do you see that this is going to help or hurt your sales? And if your sales are only dependent on the exchange rate, then maybe yes. But most people's sales are dependent on demand in markets and other things, and I'm not sure that this move is going to have much impact. So maybe you have a better answer than that. I mean, we've been scratching our heads and trying to figure out what the impact will be, and we haven't come up with either a negative or a positive.
Well, I don't see any, and so you can rethink your question, and I will, meantime, ask another question to Simon. Look, traditionally there is a lot of talk about those areas where the Europeans are on defense, in defensive mood, like agriculture, etc. But there are also the areas where the US could take a defensive position. And at least there are three in my mind. One is energy, because certainly we are here eager to get the cheap US gas, shale gas or oil. So how do you see that particular area of energy in the light of the US debate, whether to allow or not to allow the export of oil and gas from the US? Second question is on the financial services, because I have noticed that there is some debate between Washington and London, that London is extremely interested in including the financial services, while the US are taking a bit more careful approach. And the third is on the area which is already excluded, and I think mostly because of the US wish, and that's the military procurement. Whether you can imagine under any circumstances that the US would be even willing, to include at least part of the military procurement area into this business.
On the energy point, I have not heard that mentioned in the context of the TTIP. Yep. Is that better?
Yeah.
The energy, the export of liquid natural gas, I have not heard that mentioned in the context of the TTIP. That's not to say it couldn't be. It's mostly been an internal debate on whether we should allow the export. And just to be clear, and it's probably obvious, I'm all in favor of that. Yes, we should allow it. I do feel like the debate is moving in that direction, that we will allow it. I feel like the arguments against it are fairly weak. And also I think WTO rules require us to allow it. So I think we're kind of, the policy makes sense that we should allow it, and I think we also have to, or else people will file WTO complaints against us. So it's not to say this couldn't come up in the context of the TTIP. I haven't heard it yet, and hopefully we won't even need to get into that. We will just approve the sale for export, and that will be the end of it. Financial services is something that I have tried to get my head around for months, and it gets very technical. It gets into certain service types of services that I don't fully understand. So I feel like that there's a reluctance in the U.S. to open up the financial services market to European service providers, and I can't understand why. Is it because we're trying to preserve this market for ourselves, or is it because we fear that we won't be able to regulate the way we want to? This will somehow undermine our regulation. And I feel like these are two very different things. And I think we should be able to write any international financial services rules in a way that allows us to regulate to the extent that we want, while still allowing in foreign competition. But I don't know. The sector is complicated enough that I just can't quite get a handle on, are there any legitimate concerns that people in the U.S. are expressing? And I'm just not sure about that. I tend to favor a very simple, let's just write the trade rules that say in a way that says you can't discriminate against the foreigners, but you can still regulate however you want to regulate. But maybe there are areas where it's more complex than that, but I haven't been able to sort through it. But there's clearly a lot of pressure within the U.S. not to include financial services in the TTIP in any way, and I don't. Yeah, like I said, I don't know why. Are they? Is it a fear that they won't be able to regulate, or are they actually trying to keep out foreign competition? And it may be that different people have different ideas, but none of them have stated it clearly enough that I feel like I can grasp it. On military procurement, that's obviously pretty sensitive. I don't know. I haven't heard anything specifically about that, but when I hear military, I think, that they're not going to liberalize that. I don't have any specific information there, but. It's sensitive enough that it wouldn't surprise me if that were just completely excluded. But I can also imagine that they would recognize that there are certain things that the military buys that really aren't that sensitive. I think the military buys all kinds of things. So I'm sure there are plenty of examples. But that is certainly ripe for continued exclusion because it's got the word military in it.
So we do have 3:28:29. So either one more question or we could go for coffee. So there is man.
Hello, Excellencies. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm George Tape from the Metropolitan University in Prague. I wish to ask you, Mr. Weston, Stacey, you mentioned that the U.S. and the EU partnership in trade has been the largest in history. And the transatlantic trade has been dominating the global world for quite a long time. What do you think about countries like BRIC states, new actors getting into the system, who are trying to be predominantly dominant into trade as well? Are you skeptical and worried about the fact that this enjoyment you've been having in history for quite a long time is going to collapse in the near future? This dominance of the BRIC, of the EU and the transatlantic trade, are you worried, and how do you see the development of the new actors into the international system like the BRIC states in their own trade system? Are they going to dominate this long-lasting history you've had with the EU, or in the transatlantic trade together?
It was difficult to understand here, but it was about the impact on the third countries, or it was about the fear of the Americans and the Europeans keeping a certain position in the global affairs?
So what I mean here is, because Mr. Stacey said that the US and the EU partnership in trade has been quite large in history. So what I was asking is, are you worried about the fact that you have new actors into the system, like the BRIC states, BRIC?
Are you worrying, Weston?
No, I mean, the reason that I stated that was because if you're looking to generate further economic growth, you can either look at small markets and make big gains, or you could look where you have traditional relationships and you can make incremental gains which are of a larger nominal value. And so when the U.S. Chamber was looking at where can the U.S. and the EU generate more growth, where can they generate more GDP growth and generate more jobs and future prosperity, the first place to look is at the current trading partners. And the trade flows between the U.S. and the EU are probably the best areas to generate substantial gains in the coming years. So that's why I said it. I don't think it's a worry that we're trying to protect the largest trade relationship in history. If it goes away, it goes away. But if the U.S. is going to grow, and if the EU is going to grow, one of the first places that we should look is where we do the most business, and that's with each other. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it brings this session to the end. So we'll have 15 minutes for a coffee break. Coffee will be served in the rooms just right off the podium, and we will get together here at 3:45 to hear about the European perspective.